All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for attending this important webinar on long-term care strategies. I'm so pleased that you're taking a little bit of time to do some advanced planning. There's nothing better than being ahead of the ball instead of behind the 8 ball. And that's the purpose of this webinar, since long-term care is a very confusing sector. I know that working with a lot of different financial advisors and wealth managers, long-term care seems to be the one piece of the puzzle that befuddles people most, and there's been a lot of changes and innovations in this sector as well. So without much ado, we will get right to it. I'll share my screen and we can get into our presentation. Okie dokie. So planning for long-term care, like I said, it's not for the faint of heart. It's not fun to talk about, but putting your head in the sand is probably the worst thing we can do when it comes to thinking about long-term care. And here's the reason why. 3 out of 4 of us, male or female, are going to need long-term care in our lifetimes. And in fact, women are even more likely than men to need it. Also, once women go into long-term care, they tend to last longer than men. So not only do we have a higher likelihood of needing it, but we should hope to have more funds available for that period of our lives, because we tend to last quite a long time. The old adage of the old maid who lasts and lasts and lasts for a really long time, that's an old adage or a cliche for a reason. Women, they just kind of keep ticking. But it's not just a female thing. All of us, as we start to live longer and longer, face a high likelihood of needing long-term care. And the sad thing is that your regular health insurance does not cover long-term care. Your disability insurance does not cover long-term care. And in fact, hardly any of Medicare covers long-term care. Only about 10% of claims are covered by Medicare, and only in very special circumstances. It's a sort of misconception that Medicare covers long-term care. We don't have a social safety net in our country, unfortunately. So planning for long-term care is more important than ever. It's actually a financial issue as well as a personal issue, because what will happen when you go into long-term care is there will be huge expenses, and that will be paid for out of a person's retirement assets. So typically, what most people have set aside is a 401k, and a long-term care claim is likely to deplete a person's 401k. So if you don't like thinking about it in terms of your personal wealth, personal health, thinking of it in terms of protection for your personal wealth is another way to understand the need for long-term care. Think of it as protection against depleting your 401k after you worked so hard to accumulate it, in the hopes that you would be able to enjoy it, or at least pass it along to your heirs and not have to use it all up for this difficult period of our lives. Long-term care is not just about ourselves as well, it's about the people around us, because we end up, of course, and it's hard to think about, but we end up being very vulnerable. We need somebody to take care of us, and that ends up often putting the burden on a family member. Women are far more likely to end up being the family member who ends up taking care of a relative who needs long-term care. 75% of all caregivers are unpaid female family members. So that cliche of the sandwich generation, and the women being really stuck in the middle, still taking care of little ones and then also taking care of aging parents. It's far too common. I see it all the time. And often most people who come to Quantum asking for long-term care have just experienced a really sad experience where a family member has needed long-term care, assets have gotten depleted, someone's been really burnt out trying to provide care, when it would have been nice if they would have been able to hire help instead to at least support the care for an aging relative. Often people who have seen this issue firsthand are the ones who come to Quantum asking for long-term care insurance. And one of the reasons we do these webinars is we want to try and outreach and educate as much as we humanly can to prepare people with protections that can make this period of life so much easier to handle with just a little bit of careful planning. So, if and when you become it as far as a caregiver, you can expect to be spending about 25 hours a week taking care of that elderly and aging or vulnerable relative. If it's your partner who ends up being the one needing long-term care, you'll spend about 45 hours a week taking care of them. You will absolutely spend a lot of personal money on costs of care. And of course, there's a lot of strain. There's a lot of strain and impact on the job that you may have, that you have to try and juggle while you're also taking care of an elderly and struggling relative. And most people who are being hit by becoming the family caregiver role are around the age of around 45, give or take. So one thing to think about is protecting ourselves so we are comfortable at this period of our lives. And so we're not passing on a burden to anybody. And also, if you happen to be close to this age of this 45-year age where your parents are likely or possibly getting ready to start entering this vulnerable period of their lives, it might be smart to think about how can you prevent becoming the caregiver if there's still time to do any kind of planning and seek some long-term care solutions for your parents before this could potentially hit you. So what is long-term care? It's when we cannot do 2 out of 6 activities of daily living. Activities of daily living are things like eating, toileting, getting in and out of bed, dressing ourselves, bathing ourselves. It's a standard protocol where if a person can't do 2 out of 6 ADLs, which is what they're called, a doctor will certify that with a doctor's letter or note, and all of the different carriers in the industry will accept that as being what indicates that a person has now entered a period where they need long-term care. For example, if somebody has a stroke and then they're in a wheelchair, they would automatically need long-term care because they could probably not do any of these activities alone. Or if someone has become infirm, or with Alzheimer's, that also can trigger things. Sometimes with Alzheimer's, they might, still be able to do a lot of these activities, but they also still are needing full-time care because they can kind of go off the rails a little bit, get lost, get confused. But these are the general guidelines for what will dictate the fact that a doctor would confirm that we need help with tasks. So I was talking about this a little bit before, but what are some of the things that can prompt the need for long-term care? Well, older age comes fraught with potential for this period of time sort of hitting. One of the biggest ones that will get us is Alzheimer's or dementia. I can't tell you how many people come. Oh, hello, Tracy. Nice to see you here. It's nice to see you here, Tracy.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Had a little Zoom issue, but we're good now.
Yeah, I think we had a bunch of Zoom issues. I think what LinkedIn did was it said that this was a 12 o'clock event when it's actually a 2 o'clock event, and the admin's trying to figure that out. So I'm just going ahead and recording it and I'll share it, but it's great to see you here. And so thanks for joining. And if you have questions, feel free to pop in with questions about anything that I go through so that you can learn as much as possible. The goal of this is to help people be prepared for this period of life, get really good information. And then if there's opportunities for them to navigate through this strategically, of course, we're here to help. So your questions are very welcome. What I was just talking about is what are the sort of things that will often prompt the need for long-term care. So the typical culprits are, pretty familiar to us all. Alzheimer's is a big one. I can't tell you how many clients will come and tell me stories of, elderly relatives who have faced Alzheimer's and what a toll that has taken on their family. Osteoporosis is a huge one for women, and that's something to really watch out for because as Dr. Victoria Sorley Aguilar, who's in our WOW Mastermind, talks about a lot, some of the changes in hormonal health can lead to osteoporosis. And so women are specifically at risk with osteoporosis, leading to frailty that results in the need for long-term care. Of course, stroke, cancer, high blood pressure, arthritis, head and hip injuries are really, really common. Parkinson's disease, these are just the top 10. There are a lot of other things that can trigger the need for long-term care, obviously. Another one that people don't think about as much is depression. There's a lot of depression that can set in sometimes for the elderly with isolation and other things. And heart disease is another really big one. Basically, long-term care, what people need to understand is it's not so much something that's temporary. It's something that's not going to get better. That's, if anything, probably only going to get worse. So where disability covers, let's say, a short-term accident or illness, even if somebody was in a full body cast for a year, but the expectation is that they would eventually heal and be back on their feet, that would be more of a disability. A long-term care is something that's going to be chronic and persistent, and if anything, most likely decline. So there's not really an end in sight. It's just about how do we continue to live with these conditions once they've set in, and often a person needs help with 2 out of 6 activities. For example, my father had a massive stroke and he's wheelchair bound, and he will be forever, even though he did therapy and tried to recover, and he improved a lot from when the first that the stroke hit. He's still never going to be able to get in and out of bed. For example, he's paralyzed on the left-hand side and will always be, but he's lasted 7 years and counting so far since the stroke. So he's required a lot of help with activities of daily living. So, where's my next slide? Here we go. Okay. So, as I said, it's a common misconception that Medicare or Medicaid cover long-term care. Unfortunately, in our country, they do not, almost never. So about 10% of Medicare claims will be covered when it comes to long-term care, and only in very, very special circumstances, and usually only for a limited number of days. Sometimes Medicare can pay for, let's say, the first 3 months following a major event. But eventually, once a person is considered to have stabilized, they have to move into either a facility or they want to go back home. Medicare does not cover that at all. It's up to the people or the family of the people to somehow come up with that money, and it gets very expensive. The average long-term care cost in 30 years is estimated to be about $1.3 million per person. Also, people think maybe their Medicare supplement plan is going to cover it, the Medigap. But no, that's not true. They may cover, again, a slight portion of costs during those first 3 months following a critical event. But as we just said, with long-term care events, they are ongoing and persistent, and they tend to last much, much more than 100 days. And so the burden of care for oneself falls on ourselves. And that's why it's so important to have a plan for long-term care in your retirement portfolio. Some people think Medicaid is there, to catch the people who didn't do any planning. Well, yes and no. So the only way you can apply for and qualify for Medicaid is if you have completely denuded your estate and you have no assets at all. You have to have less than $2,000 to your name. Okay. And I have seen Medicaid facilities firsthand. They're really difficult. It's usually about 3 people to a room. I have seen, where you get them an Apple Watch or an Apple iPad, and you go and it's not there the next time because it's just gone, or if you get clothing and you label it carefully that it belongs to your friend who's in the Medicaid facility, when you go see them the next time, those clothes are nowhere to be found. They're not wearing what you bought for them. It's kind of sad. It's not a comfortable way to be in that period of one's life. So while some people think, oh, well, that's fine, I'll just do Medicaid, it's really not going to be very comfortable. And those who have assets will have a very, very difficult time both qualifying for that situation or even being comfortable in that situation. It's much, much better just to think about, how do you want to direct that period of your life? You will have funds. You'll have funds available for it from the insurance carrier. And then there are lots of choices for where one can live in comfort, especially now with more and more facilities opening up for aging communities. There's a wide gamut of opportunity for living in actual comfort if you've done proper planning. So it's really important people learn this, because unfortunately, it's just not talked about enough. And I think there's a major gap in people's awareness when it comes to the long-term care situation in our country. And on that note, I also think there's a big gap in awareness on just how widespread this issue is, and that it's just beginning. So baby boomers are maturing and people are living longer than ever. In fact, we are looking to have probably 19 million people in the US who will be elderly by the time we all are in our 80s and 90s. Right now there's about 6.8 Americans, but the baby boomers are just beginning to get into that long-term care period of life. And what that's doing is putting a lot of pressure on the system and increasing the costs for long-term care, just because supply and demand, the more there's a demand for something, the smaller the supply and prices go up. So as the boomers are just now beginning to get into long-term care needs, most of the consciousness of people is just not really realizing the magnitude of this problem. And we're in the early days of seeing where this is all going to trend, which is one of the reasons I try to help people who are in their planning years right now, between the ages of, let's say, 35 and 55 or 60, It's really critical to try to set ourselves up for some kind of solution, because by the time we're aging into this period of life, the landscape will be even more challenging. We talked a little bit about this, but even right now, for example, my father, when he had his stroke, he wanted to be at home. People are much more comfortable in their own home. Well, it costs about $10,000 a month for full-time round-the-clock care in one's own house today. And with inflation, of course, we can expect, and also with the vectors of supply and demand constricting the market, like I just said, we can expect costs for that to go even higher, much, much higher by the time many of us are entering this period of our lives. So again, by 2050, it's important for anyone who wants to be retiring in comfort and to be prepared for long-term care to have at least $1.3 million per person allocated for this period of life. And the idea is you want to have this allocated through either, if you're super, super wealthy, your own funds, that's fine, or an insurance carrier who's willing to take that risk on for you, so that the other assets you're working so hard to grow can actually be used for fun. You don't have to be saving them all up for this rainy day period of life. Now, there are lots of ways that we can get long-term care. There's in-home care, which I said is the most expensive. There's assisted living facilities. There are nursing homes. Right now, the average cost, whether you're in a nursing home, assisted living, or in-home care, is between $5,000 and $10,000 a month, kind of no matter where you go, especially here in California. In the Midwest, it's a little bit less expensive. And there are more and more interesting models that are developing where one can, let's say, at early age, 55, 60, move into a community where it's really just a living arrangement. There's no long-term care yet, but there are facilities so that as a person ages up and or becomes more sick, then they can move into different areas within that community where long-term care is available, skilled nursing is available. And the good thing is that long-term care policies, if designed properly, can be used to pay even for arrangements like that, depending on the kind of policy that one gets. So one thing that kind of boggles my mind is people put their heads a lot in the sand about long-term care. And I really don't understand it, because we don't really question that we need our health insurance. We understand, especially after COVID, that it's really important. We buy auto insurance. Of course, we're legally bound to do that. And actually in California, we may soon be legally bound to have long-term care. There's a lot of discussion about mandating that now, because the governments are very aware of this issue. In Washington state, they did just mandate long-term care insurance being required, but we're not there fully across the country yet. But in terms of auto insurance, we buy it because we know that there's a chance that something could go wrong, and we have that protection. And even with our homes, we tend to have homeowners insurance because we understand the risks. But for long-term care, for some reason, this isn't an area that most people are actively thinking about and insuring against or protecting against. And I really don't understand it, because long-term care, once a person needs it, completely can wipe out a person's lifetime savings. And I just don't see why somebody wouldn't want to protect themselves and have the insurance carrier at the ready to cover that risk, instead of having to let themselves be bearing the full brunt of that happening, especially when 3 out of 4 people are going to need long-term care, which is one of the reasons I try to do these webinars and raise awareness. This might be obvious, but to me, the downside of not planning is so much worse than the downside of planning, right? The downside of planning is you're going to purchase a correctly designed policy and build that into your portfolio. And even those can be designed such that there are ancillary benefits inside the policy that can grow cash for you. And, there is definitely stuff you can do. But the downside of not planning is kind of, to me, sort of catastrophic. It's being a burden to others, like we talked about, saddling someone else in the family with taking care of us, with toileting us or getting us in and out of bed. It's a little difficult for everybody to have that circumstance, and or the risk of getting very poor care, of being really uncomfortable, being forced to go into a Medicaid facility, for example, and being just somewhere that a person is miserable. It sounds terrible to me, which is why I've made sure I've done my long-term care planning. There's also the risk of outliving our income and depleting all the wealth we've hoped to pass down generationally to often, for our children. We hope to be able to let the generation that comes after us live better than the generation that came before. But what happens is when there isn't planning in a household, the depletion of assets is severe. and often can leave even the people behind, even with debt or an absolute depletion of what might have otherwise been at least some generational wealth. And then also, and this is one of the saddest ones, when we haven't prepared for this period of life, it puts a lot of stress on a family, and disputes, unfortunately, are bound to happen. I know, and this is very personal, but when my father had his stroke, he didn't have a long-term care policy. He was, in fact, uninsurable. But there were huge disagreements about where we should put him and how we should solve for this period of life, because he hadn't done planning. And not only was it difficult to have my father going through this stroke, but it was difficult to be having the stress of arguments within the family. So this is something I've experienced firsthand. I believe having a policy that dictates, look, this is what the money is for, put me in a nice place, that's what it is. It takes away the room for dispute, and that can't be underestimated. I've actually seen some families fall apart based on arguments that have happened, and I think it's really, really sad.
I agree. I just have the family thing too, parents and stuff, and we take responsibility for them compared to other siblings. So I completely understand.
Yeah, it's such more common than people hear about. It's like the whole King Lear thing in Shakespeare. As a kid, I never understood it, but it really does. When one person has been in charge and then there's a change of the guard, and then the next generation has all these different opinions, it's if it's not very well organized, it can wreak real havoc. So yeah, it happens all the time, even with the very closest and the best families, which was a shock to me when I started seeing that happen with clients. So how does long-term care protection work? So what insurance does is it provides a pool of money, or benefit dollars, let's call them, to be used for long-term care the moment it's needed. Okay, so sometimes there's maybe a 30, 60, or 90-day wait before the benefits will kick in. But as we said, a long-term care situation is going to be chronic, persistent, and long-term. So it's probably going to last for years. And so that 30, 60, or 90 days where it takes time to realize that this situation is happening is over in the blink of an eye. And thankfully, with an insurance product, the benefits start kicking in. So there are dollars that can be paid in the form of reimbursement for care received, and there are dollars that can be provided upfront as cash to be used to pay for care received. That's the two main kinds of insurance products out there today. And we'll get a little bit into all the different kind of products there are. But the ones that reimburse, you need to get the care and then keep the receipts and then submit it to the carrier and then get reimbursed with dollars to make yourself whole. And sometimes when you're using a provider, you have to make sure you're using from a list of approved providers, let's say, for example, just to be sure that you'll qualify for the reimbursement. So that's reimbursement methods. And then there are indemnity plans where they just give you cash up front and say, use it for whatever you need, anything you need at all. We don't need receipts. This is your cash. Personally, I really prefer indemnity designs. I think they're really useful, but there are pros and cons, and there's so many different kind of products. And so everyone's circumstance is a little bit different. It is important to learn as you're learning about long-term care, though, that those are the two main kinds. And there's a big difference between the two, because cash up front is a lot more flexible. Reimbursement based is a little more hassle, and there can be a little bit more restriction around what kind of care you're allowed to get reimbursed for, or who you have to use as a provider, say, for example, for the care. One really good thing about long-term care dollars is the pool of benefits is guaranteed from day one, the minute you buy your policy. Now, a 401k, as you know, there's no guarantee, and it's designed to grow over time, and we hope our assets will be much greater in 20 years, than they are today. But they need the time to reach that amount, and there also are no guarantees. If you get a long-term care policy that's a $500,000 long-term care policy, let's say, even from day one, $500,000 of long-term care is available, no matter what and when the long-term care situation hits. So that's one advantage of having the insurance carrier cover this risk, because you don't have to grow to finally one day have this. Hopefully, it's just covered from day one, and it has a lot of security. That's how risk management works in general. It gives you a lot of guarantees and promises that they cannot break, unlike some other financial tools, which are hopefully going to do well, but there are no guarantees. Insurance is all about promises and guarantees. The dollars can be used, as I said before, for coordination of care at home, in a facility, and in assisted living care, even in some of these fancy communities that are evolving, especially if they are indemnity based, where you're just getting cash up front. You can use it for anything. You can use it to pay your nephew to come by your house 3 times a week and do a little cleaning and buy some groceries for you. It's your dollar, so you get to use it however you want. In a reimbursement model, like I said, there can be some more restrictions. You might have to use a certain kind of vendor. They must have certain licenses, et cetera, for the reimbursement model. But on the indemnity model, it's just your own cash. You can use it however you want. There are a lot of different ways to solve for long-term care, right? There's traditional long-term care policies. Mutual of Omaha is an example of this. They are use it or lose it. In other words, they cover only for long-term care. There's no death benefit. If a person passes away and never used long-term care, let's say they passed away in their sleep peacefully and they never aged and became vulnerable to where they couldn't do 2 out of 6 activities of daily living, well, then that long-term care policy was kind of a waste because they never triggered the long-term care benefit. It doesn't pay out a death benefit at all. But a traditional standalone long-term care policy can sometimes be less expensive than certain other kinds of policies. And sometimes it can have an inflation rider, or sometimes there are 2-party discounts. So they still have their place. Each of these solutions has pros and cons, and that's where Quantum comes in. We really help evaluate all the different solutions and then tailor solutions around a person's circumstances. There are also life insurance policies that have long-term care, or sometimes called chronic or critical illness care riders, baked into the policies, or sometimes they can be added to the policies at a slight extra cost. This is a really interesting development in the life insurance market over the last 15 years. They're fantastic solutions. I'm a huge fan of them, especially if someone is on the younger end when they start to do their planning, because you have a life insurance policy which is going to pay a death benefit no matter what. And that death benefit can be accessed while the person is still alive, if needed, for long-term care. And it can kind of be a mix and match as well. So let's say there's $1 million life insurance policy with a chronic or long-term care type rider included. Then a person ends up needing long-term care. They maybe need $700,000 of long-term care. They access that as pure cash to use however they want for long-term care. Let's say then they pass away. The remaining $300,000 is still paid out as a death benefit. I love these because they're gonna for sure get used one way or another. There's no way for the money to go down the drain. I love that they're flexible because it's a cash-based model, not a reimbursement model. They can be a little bit more expensive depending on when a person starts their life insurance policy. And there's always pros and cons, right? Life insurance, you have to be healthy enough to get insured. So there's a little bit of that. Sometimes if you have a medical condition and it costs just too much for life insurance, you might not take that approach. But it's really good to know that these exist because I think they're very, very helpful and flexible in many ways. There have also been some products coming out over the last 10 years or so, which I call hybrid policies with living benefits. One America is an example of this, and there are many, many others. They're similar to life insurance policies with chronic care riders in a sense, in that they'll tend to have some long-term care benefit and or some death benefit, and or perhaps some cash inside of the policy that also grows. Sometimes they can have inflation riders built in, which is good, which means the amount of long-term care you have from day one actually grows and helps keep pace a little bit with the cost of living. They are very interesting. And again, there are pros and cons to all of these designs, but it's just really good to know that they exist and that they're worth looking at in certain circumstances. There are also annuities that have long-term care features, often something what's called like an income doubler feature or an income tripler feature, which means that the annuity will double the amount of annuitized income if a person needs long-term care. This is especially attractive for people who are maybe a little bit older when they're finally getting around to doing their long-term care planning, and or people who aren't healthy enough to get life insurance, because the great thing about an annuity is you do not have to go through medical underwriting at all. So we use these often as a backup, depending on if a person's a bit older, maybe someone who's much older, someone's in their 70s, and getting a life insurance product or a long-term care policy might be impossible due to their health or just so expensive due to their costs that we have to go around it another way. Well, sometimes someone might be able to fund an annuity with a long-term care doubler, and it's a great way to prepare for long-term care. And then there's always self-insuring, which sometimes gets talked about. If a person's extremely wealthy, then self-insuring definitely has its place. I like to say if you're going to be worth 25 million and up, and you've done proper estate planning, so you know that you're not going to be putting your estate exposure to a lot of estate taxes, because those are also going to be a big deal starting in 2026. Then yeah, if you think you're going to have at least $1.3 million per person set aside for just this purpose, and it won't have to compete with the rest of your retirement assets, then self-insuring is certainly an option. It doesn't solve for what can sometimes be, unfortunately, a conflict of interest among the heirs. Because sometimes what happens is, again, there's debate, should we put them in the most expensive facility or should we put them in a cheaper facility? Or, sometimes, I hate to say it, but sometimes people are a little worried that they don't want to use all the money up. And so they're going to kind of be resistant and try to cheap out on you. So I like the idea of having a long-term care policy that's just set for this purpose, that's meant to be used. So there's just no debate about how someone would use the money I grew to take care of me. But that's because I'm a little bit of a control freak. But that said, self-insuring is definitely an absolute possibility. And if you are going to self-insure, I would recommend still creating very strict plans, so people know how to handle a circumstance if it should arise, and that you can say, look, I expect to be put in this facility. I don't want any debates about it. It doesn't hurt to have these kinds of things set out in writing ahead of time. If you're not going to have around 1.3 million per person, it's much, much better to use the insurance carrier to cover this risk. You'll just definitely come out ahead. It prevents a host of problems. And I can't encourage people enough to at least look at opportunities for avoiding the problems that can arise if you haven't properly insured. Okay, so this is kind of a page meant to try to help those who are looking at long-term care know the differences between some of the main types of solutions that exist that we just covered on the previous page. So annuities, as I said, they're really great for people with maybe some health issues who can't qualify insurance, or they've waited a bit long to do their planning and costs are getting prohibitive for the life insurance. It's great that you can use IRAs to fund protection. There are index annuities now that can absolutely insulate against market downturns, which is another great feature of certain annuities. Just as a side note, I don't recommend variable insurance of any kind, not variable annuities or variable life insurance. I believe that if you're looking at risk management products, what you're paying for is security. So make sure you're looking at index products if you can. If you're very risk averse, you can look at guaranteed products. Depends on your age and exactly how much upside you still want to be able to capture, but stay away from anything variable. So fixed or index annuities are great if people are maybe over the age of around 55 or 60, depending on their health or budget, especially if you or a family member has a lump sum that's sitting somewhere else and they don't have any long-term care. You can easily reallocate a lump sum into an annuity that would have an income doubler feature for long-term care. And it might be a really great way to help get some planning in place. As we said, there's always life insurance with chronic and critical illness riders. Certain states, they are fantastic and really competitive. Certain states, they're a little bit more limited. New York, for example, is a bit limited in terms of how many carriers are in the market at all. So you always need to do a cost benefit analysis and see what's going to be the most efficient and effective way. Long-term care, traditional long-term care insurance is really interesting. The rates on long-term care products now, traditional long-term care products, are no longer guaranteed, unfortunately. The reason is people are living way too long, and the insurance carriers that originally were in the long-term care market have been pricing out. They've been getting sort of leaving the market or even trying to stop covering this at all because people live longer than they ever expected and they never charged enough in the beginning for the risks that they signed up to insure. Fortunately, it's all backed by the state. But because it's backed by the state, traditional long-term care insurance carriers have gotten the go-ahead from states to raise rates even on existing policies. And they've done so many, many times over the last 15 years, often around 35 or 40% rate increases, even on existing policies. And they continue having to do that just so that they can make sure they're recouping enough to not go bankrupt. And the carriers are getting permission to do this because the states, who would have to bail out these carriers if they did go bankrupt and then come through on the risk, have said, no, do what you've got to do. So because of that, traditional long-term care policies, right now, when I have a couple maybe come to me, we will look at them, but we always try to plan ahead knowing that rate increases on those premiums are likely. So it's important not to get fooled. Sometimes a traditional long-term care policy can look so much cheaper, but the odds are that the premiums will go up by the time you need to use them. So it's really important to have a sophisticated advisor taking a look at solutions for you and weighing pros and cons. But traditional long-term care insurance, good thing is often it has a cost of living rider that you can add, and there are two-party discounts. So if you're healthy and you can get insured, sometimes it's a more cost-effective way to take care of this risk. And then there are those hybrid products that I talked about. There are, North American, for example, or One America, some really interesting options. You can fund them sometimes with a lump sum. You can fund them with ongoing premiums, or maybe just a design where you're planning to fund it until you're 65 and then the policy is fully paid up. Lots and lots of choices. So that's the good news about it. The bad news is it can be a little confusing, and that you really need to be working with someone who knows the ins and outs so you know what you're getting. I'm just going to address this briefly. The myth that, we can all just easily self-insure for long-term care. Some of us, if we're extremely wealthy, probably can self-insure, okay? However, most people don't have the money set aside to cover estate taxes, their retirement dreams. This is actually enjoying the money in retirement, using it, traveling, taking care of family members, etc., and still having plenty left over for this period of life. It's a little risky in my view, because it depends on really good luck, luck that you won't need an extended period of long-term care, or that costs won't be so crazy high by the time you need it. I never understand why people would do it unless they really know that they have more than enough assets. And even if they do, I would really encourage people to create a plan for their long-term care that outlines for relatives what your expectations are, even if it's going to be a self-insured model, to say, these are my expectations, how it should be used. I don't want this to be up to debate. That way you do the favor of taking the stress of this, at least, off of those who are going to be impacted by that time of your need. So if you haven't done long-term care planning yet, and you want to know how to get started doing it, I would say, first thing is just understand your circumstances and think about where you are at risk. Do you have aging parents that are not right now protected against long-term care? Is that something that might be in your future? And is there still time to do something about it before disaster strikes, through potentially speaking with someone, seeing if there's a way to get a policy in place that can help with the planning and the paying for that need? Think about the consequences to those that you may have as children if you haven't done your own long-term care planning. And know that the best time to do planning is really when you're young and healthy. And by young and healthy, what I mean is if you're between the ages of, let's say, 35 and 55, you can get some really great pricing on some really great solutions in the hands of a really good advisor that will just fit really nicely into your portfolio. If you're over the age of 55 and you're still healthy, great. It just gets a little bit more expensive. By the time you get to be 60 or 65, it gets a little bit harder because you're so much more expensive. And also, a lot of people start to have health conditions. And the more one has health conditions, because these are health-related products, sometimes carriers could decline you, or your options become more limited. So just understand where you are right now in terms of risk. That's really important. That way you know what to start trying to protect if you need to protect against anything. Then develop a strategy and have some conversations. Remember, it's a family issue because it's going to impact everybody around you. Maybe have some conversations with you. If you have aging parents, have some conversations with them. Do you have any long-term care? Do you have a plan in place? You'd be amazed how few people actually talk about this. And instead of putting our heads in the sand, it's really good to get aware and try to be ahead of time on things, get ahead of the game if you can, because the outcomes are just so much better than if we wait until there's a crisis and then we're scrambling to try to figure out what to do. I know they're not easy to have these conversations, but again, it's so much better than sticking our head in the sand. And then when it comes time for implementing, if you get good advisory help and you are able to look at options and find solutions that are going to help get you protection against this period of life, then perfect. You're going to have that policy, you're going to put it in place and you'll fund it. And then you also want to make sure you're going to have a trust and a will, of course, and some advanced healthcare directives that outline your intentions and your preferences for how this period of life should be handled, who would perhaps have the power of attorney if you're incapacitated, and a caregiving plan. Even if, let's say, you have older parents who refuse to talk about it, well, that is what it is, but then you can at least make sure you don't pass a burden on to others and you clean up your little corner of your universe with your own planning. If anybody ever wants help with looking at long-term care, please know this is an area of specialty. You're in good hands at Quantum. Hopefully those of you who are attending know Quantum is an insurance consulting firm based out of Los Angeles. We're totally commissions agnostic, which means we work with every single carrier in the market that has an A rating or higher. And we are not bound to the idea of upselling or working with one carrier because the commission is higher. We like to look at it as a math problem and a people problem and solve for efficiency in terms of best value, which is a combination of price and coverage tailored to a person's specific needs and circumstances. We handle clients all across the US, so we can help anyone and everyone who might need help in this arena. I like to say, think of us as your insurance nerds. And with that, I can open up to any questions if anybody has it. And I do just want to say thank you so much for attending this. I hope you left with a little bit more awareness about this period of life and what you can do to protect yourself for it.
Jennifer, this was excellent. Really appreciate the information. My in-laws actually had long-term care because they were both school teachers and they had it through their providers through the system. But I'm curious as to when you can, let's say you're over 55. I mean, can you still get long-term care? If you're over 65, can you still get long-term care? What are the obligations or what are the possibilities for long-term care depending on ages?
Yes. So first of all, if you're healthy, you have way more options, right? Sometimes people start having a lot of medical conditions. And if they have a couple medical, conditions, the traditional long-term care carriers have gotten more and more picky. They very much cherry pick these days. For example, I had a guy, he was, let's say 52. He had an enlarged heart. His physician felt he was perfectly fine, but he got declined for traditional long-term care because they just don't want to touch anything that they think might end up leading to the person needing their insurance before they can recoup enough in premiums to come out ahead, right? Because they've already taken so many losses in this sector because people are living longer than ever. So traditional long-term care, I'd say at this point, about half of the clients I would take to a market for traditional long-term care get approved. The other half can get declined for things that we personally wouldn't think are that big of a deal or justify getting declined. The good news is if you're looking at life insurance or hybrid solutions, they are much more forgiving when it comes to underwriting. So you can still get a hybrid product, no problem. Probably until you're in your 70s, you could theoretically buy a life insurance or a hybrid product. The question is, it starts to get more and more expensive, the older one is, because then the mortality risk is higher. And so the premiums are higher. Just for an example, if a person's 30 years old, they can get $1 million of term life insurance for $300 a year. Once they're 60, if they want $1 million of term life insurance, it's likely going to cost about $30,000 a year. So as we get older, the cost for life insurance itself goes higher. So if we're trying to use a life insurance product as the chassis for a long-term care solution, the cost will get higher. But if a person's very healthy, that means that they can get discounts. And that's where the analysis piece comes in. So I would say the news to take away is, yes, it's certainly not at all too late, especially if you're younger and healthier. It's easier. 55 is still, younger in terms of where some people get around to doing their planning as a female, because we tend to have long lifespans. And worse comes to worse, if someone's in their 70s and they don't have a solution, that's usually where we look at annuities instead, and those income doubler features that can really help with long-term care planning. that's where we normally would then start looking at annuities instead, is if they're getting to the point where their health or their age is getting so high that the cost for insurance would make it not as feasible. Annuities are completely different, right? And then it's just a question of, do you have a lump sum that you might be able to set aside and repurpose for this need? And so, yeah, there are lots and lots of solutions. The only reason I say 35 to 55 is ideal is that if you're in that window, you can start a hybrid policy that's like maybe $3,500 to $5,500 a year and fund it. And you'll have incredible long-term care, you'll have incredible death benefit, and you'll even have incredible cash value growth inside that policy. It's like crazy how cheap it can be if you start early. So that's why I try to teach people about this sooner rather than later.
That's excellent. Thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you for, what a great question. So if anybody has any other questions or would like to get in touch, please feel free to reach out. We love helping people learn more about insurance. We are passionate insurance nerds. I love these products because they come through on promises and they help provide a lot of security to people, especially when they're at their most vulnerable. And that's something I personally really appreciate. So if you found this to be useful, feel free to share with anyone you know. Quantum has a charitable referral program. So if you ever refer someone to Quantum, we like to say thank you by making a charitable donation to the nonprofit of your choice, just as our way of saying thank you as well. We really only work through referral. You know how to reach us, and you can go to our website as well if you'd like to learn anything else.